It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martingale and found the place very nothing but anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless, there were no flowers save for the late few pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to her company in winter months, as she had intended, and for myself, the Cronsons were absent in Norfolk, so it was meant to spend Christmas with old Miss Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martindale seemed like dreary enough, and the ghost stories we have laughed while the sunshine flooded the room became less unreal, and when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom, they became more real so when the servant goes after servant left us to seek our situations elsewhere. When the noises grew frequent in the house, we, ourselves, and Claire and I, in our own ears, heard the tramp and the beginning banging of the chattering which had been bad described to us. My dear reader, you are doubtless free of superstitious finances. You pooh-pooh in the existence ghosts, and only wish you could find the haunted house to which to spend the night, which is all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait till you left the drearily desolated old country mansion, filled with the most unaccountable sounds, without a servant, and without none to save the old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremis of the end of the building, heard nothing of the tramp, bang, going on all the hours of the night. At first, I imagined the noises were produced by some evil deposed persons, who wished for the purposes of their own, to keep their house uninhabited. But I digress. Claire and I came to the conclusion that the investigation must be supernatural, and Martindale consequences unattainable. Still being practical people, unlike our preceders, not having many money to live where and how we liked it, we decided to watch and see what could happen before we could trace any human influences for that matter. If not, we agreed to pull down here for the right wing of the house and principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, Claire engaged in the needlework, I reading, and revolver lying on the table bedside beside me. But nothing, neither sound or appearance awarded our vigil. In this confirmed my ideas and sounds were not supernatural, but it's just to test the matter. I determined on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep my distance in the bedchamber. Even to Claire I had mentioned my intention. About 10, tired out with our previous vigils, we decided to retire to rest, somewhat unconsciously perhaps. I nosily shut the door out of my room, and when I popped it half an hour afterwards, who mouse could have pursued it was my long corridor with a greater silence of caution other than myself. Quite in the dark, I sat in the red room for over an hour. I might as well have been a grave for anything. I could see the apartment, but at the end of the time the moon rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of the haunted chamber. Hitherto, I kept my watch on the opposite window. Now I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from the observation by the heavy bangings of the bed and the antique wardrobe. I sat on still, but still no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights watching, many of my tireless solitary vigil. I dropped my last into a slumber, which I awakened and only heard the door softly opened. "John," said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you there?" "Yes, Claire," I answered. "But what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They're in the oak parlor." I did not need to explain as to whom she meant, but we crept downstairs after her, warned her by uplifted a hand of necessity for silence and caution. By the door opened to the oak parlor. She paused as we both looked in. There was a room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing on the hearth. candles on the chimney piece, and it was a small table pulled out from the accustomed corner, the two men seated beside it, playing into cribbage. We could see the faces of the younger player. It was that about a man about 5 or 20 feet, a man who had lived very hard and wickedly. No one had wasted substance on his health, who had been while the flesh Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say I knew this was, how much of I identified the features of the player and those of the man who had been missing for 41 years. 41 years that every night he was dressed in a costume of a bygone period. His hair was powdered, and his round wrists were her ruffles or lace. He looked like one having to get from a great party, had sat down after his return home to play cards with his intimate friend. On his little finger there stood a sparkled ring, in front of the fashion by his time. He wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of a remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat on the opposite of the door, but no one lifted his eyes to shut it. His attention seemed to be all concentrated on the cards. For a time this was an utter silence of the room, broken by only the momentous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding each other's breaths, terrified of yet fascinated by the scene to which it was being acted before us. The dashes dropped at the hearth slowly like snow, and we could hear the rustle of the cards as they were being dealt out and left upon the table. We listened for the count, 15-2, 15-4, and so forth. But there was no other word spoken until that length of the player, whose face we could not exclaimed, "I win, the game is mine." His opponent took up the cards, sorted them through neglectfully in his hand, and put them close together, and flung the whole pack in the guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat, liar, take that." There was a bustle and confusion, a flinging over the chairs and fierce gesticulation, and the noise of the passionate voices mingling, and we could not hear the sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room into so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood out of the room, and tramp us up the stairs and to the Red Room, where he descended to a few minutes. A couple of raiders under his arm when he re-entered the room, and he gave us. It seemed to us that the other man has his choice of weapons. Then he flung open the window, and after this ceremoniously giving place for his opponent to pass out first, he walked into the night chair, Claire and I following. We went through the garden and went down the narrowing, winding walk to a smooth place of turf, sheltered from the north plantation of the young fire trees. It was the bright moonlight by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say free," he said, that the last two men whose back was still towards us. They ran down lots for the ground, and had a lot fallen on Mr. Lester. He then stood with us, and then moonbeams falling upon him, and the handsomer fellow I would not desire to behold. "One," began the other. "Two," and then before the kinsman and the slightest suspicion of the design, he was upon him, and it was rapper through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of the cowardly treachery, Claire screamed out loud. In a moment the combatants had disappeared, and the moon was obstructed behind the cloud, and we were standing in the shadow of the fir plantation, shivering the cold and terror, but we knew that would become the late owner of the Martingale, and that he had fallen, not in fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world. Behold the ground, and trees and shrubberies all laden, covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, such as there was no person who could remember having fallen for 41 years. It was just as such as Christmas as Mr. Jeremy disappeared, remarked an old sexton to my sister, who had insisted on dragging through the snow to church, whereupon Claire fainted away. I was carried to the vestry, where I made the full confession that Victor, out of all we behold, the previous night. At first, the worthy individual was rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when, fortnight later, the snow melted away, for a plantation came to be examined, he confessed where there might be more things in heaven and earth that just limited his philosophy that he dreamed of. The little dear space just within plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew it was by the ring and the diamond buckles and the sparkling breastpin, and Mr. Cronson, in whose capacity as magistrate came over to inspect the relics, was visibly perturbed by my narrative. Pray, Mr. Lester, did you in your dream see the face of the gentleman, you kinsman opponent? No, I said. I sat down, and he stood back to us all at the same time. There is nothing more, of course, to be done in that matter, observed Mr. Cronson. Nothing, I replied. The affair would be doubtless have terminated. But, in that few days afterwards, when we were dining in the Cronson Park, Clara all of a sudden dropped the glass of water she was carrying to her lips and exclaiming, "Look, John, there he is!" rose from the seat, within the face as white as tablecloth, pointed at the portrait hanging from the wall. I saw him for an instant when he turned his head towards the door as Jeremy Lester left, she explained. That he is. Of what followed after this identification, I have only too vaguest recollection. Servants rushed through hither and thither. Miss Cronson dropped off her chair to the Hedricks. The young ladies gathered around her mamma. Mr. Cronson, trembling like an ague had fit, attempted some kind of explanation, while Claire kept praying to be taken away, only for it to be taken away. I took her away, not merely from the Cronson Park, but from Martindale. Before we left that later place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait of Claire was identified that one of his wife's father, the last person who saw Jeremy Lester alive. He was an old man now finished, Mr. Cronson, a man of over 80, who has confessed everything to me. You won't be in sorrow and disgrace upon us, making us public matter? I promised that I would keep him in silence, but the story is gradually oozed out. The Cronsons left the country. My sister and I never returned to Martindale. She is married and now living in London, although I assure to her no stranger noises are in my house. But she will not visit Bedfordshire, where the little girl she wanted me to be a long time ago. To think seriously is how my wife and the mother of my children.